Thank you so very much. It's great to be here. You have a beautiful campus. And I bring you greetings from the students of Asbury University, where I teach. Your scholarship is well known. Your spirit is well known. As Chris mentioned, I come from Lexington, Kentucky. So your basketball team is also well known. And hopefully we'll be meeting you all sometime in the future. Right? And may the best team win. All right. If you forget everything else I say tonight, I want you to remember this. I want you to dream big. Really, I don't know where you are tonight, but I want you to dream big. Now, I would express it this way. I think God has great things in store for you. Now, you might say life has great things. You might express it differently, but there's something wonderful waiting for you. And, here you are, most of you going to school, students, you're thinking, what's going to happen in my life? Where am I going to go? I want to encourage you to dream big. Life has great things in store for you. When I was your age, well, before I was your age, I never dreamt that I would really go to college. I'm the first one in my family to go to college. My mom was a nurse. My dad was an electrician. I grew up on the blue-collar south side of Chicago. I never dreamed that I'd go to college, get a Ph.D., be an English professor. And, of course, I never dreamt that I would write a biography of C.S. Lewis, that C.S. Lewis's stepson would write a foreword for it. And as Chris mentioned, I never dreamt that one day I'd teach a class at C.S. Lewis's house and, in fact, sleep in C.S. Lewis's bed. I never dreamt that, right? And the same thing is out there waiting for you. What's in store for you, you just can't imagine. I want to encourage you to dream big. I will do 3 quick things tonight and get you out of here within an hour. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go over this handout that you have and briefly give you an introduction to C.S. Lewis's life and works. There weren't enough copies for everyone because, well, I didn't appreciate such a great turnout, so that's wonderful. If you don't have one, perhaps you can look on with somebody next to you. And this will be posted on the website if you want to download it. But anyway, it's a pretty snazzy handout for an English professor to make, I'll just say that. Then we're going to watch this short documentary that'll take about 24 minutes. And if I have time, I'm going to read just a little bit from my book and then take question and answers. And I mentioned the question and answers because what happens is if all of a sudden I say, does anybody have any questions or comments, you'll be befuddled, right? So be thinking now, hey, I'm going to ask a question, right? Or make a comment. And be ready for it when I ask you so that you're not befuddled and you're ready to go because you'll get home and you'll be saying, oh, I should have asked him that or I should have mentioned that. So anyway, and then afterwards, I'll be selling copies of my biography, A Life Observed. And if you know a little bit of Lewis, he wrote a book called A Grief Observed. See, so there's the tie-in. It has a picture of Lewis smoking a cigarette and a big cloud of smoke on the front, which drives some of the really conservative Christians at my school nuts. And I kind of like that. And then, if you're interested, I'll also be selling copies of tonight's documentary, and both are just $10. And so, and I'll be glad to sign it. And, after I sign it, you can sell it on eBay for maybe like $11 or something. All right, if you have a C.S. Lewis timeline, grab it. If you don't, maybe look on with someone else. Part 1, Early Life. In 1898, Clive Staples Lewis. And if you forget everything else besides Dream Big, you now know what CS stands for, Clive Staples. And you also know why he didn't go by his name, because who wants to be called Clive? Right? So Clive Staples Lewis is born November 29th in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Everyone thinks he's English. Well, don't tell him that, because he's Irish, right? Belfast, Northern Ireland. He's the second son of Albert, a lawyer, and Flora, a vicar's daughter. She's got a BA in math from Queen's University. Now there's lots of female math majors. Maybe there's some here tonight. Very smart, I'm sure. But back then, for your mom to go to college was a huge deal. And for her to be a math major was an even huger deal. Having said that, Lewis was horrible in math. And so if you're horrible in math, well, you're in very good company. C.S. Lewis, he was bad in math. So I'm right in there. Here's a picture of him by the side, by the way. This is back before iPhones and tablets to take pictures with. This is back then, a professional photographer would come to your house, and what? You would dress up in your, goofy little sailor suit, like Lewis did here, and try to look very cool. And no one would smile, right? Except his brother would kind of smirk. That's his older brother leaning against that round ball on the porch. And this is, of course, in his home at Little Lee, possibly the home which the professor's house is modeled after, and it's in Northern Ireland. You can go and visit there now. I did, but someone else lives there. Someone who's not incredibly open to American C.S. Lewis fans. So we had the cab take us. I said, stop here. And I said, we'll walk up there. I said, Sharon, get the camera ready. And I said, when I'm right in front of the driveway, I'm going to back in 5 steps. You take the picture. I'm going to run back out. So, yes, I have a bad picture of me and Little Lee. And that's the picture of the house they lived in, just down below. In 1902, for no known reason other than what? His name was Clive. Lewis announces to the family that he's to be called Jackson. Now, some of you are going to do primary research later, and you'd think that Lewis was born in the Middle Ages. There's 3 stories of why he picked Jackson. One is there was a neighbor boy named Jack that he liked. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Another story is that there was a dog, a neighborhood dog named Jack that he liked. And then the corollary to that, and that Jack the dog had just been run over by a cart. No one knows which of these are true. All they know is he comes downstairs and says, I am Jackson, a name he will use from then on. David Downing, Lewis scholar, has suggested Lewis would, quote, spend the rest of his life defining himself and his world differently from the conventions that he inherited, right? You're supposed to be called Clive Stables. He says, no, I'm going to be called Jack. 1905, the family moves to Little Lee, and there's the picture, that third one. A large, rambling, book-filled house on the outskirts of Belfast, where the brothers are allowed to roam freely. Lewis would later write, and this is a lovely passage, listen to this one. I am a product of long corridors, empty, sunlit rooms, upstairs indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tiles. Also of endless books. I know there are some future writers up there, and one of the things you can do is spend a lot of time listening to noises like this in big old houses and being inspired, and let your imagination roam. 1908, Lewis's mother dies of cancer when Lewis is 9, and Lewis is sent with warning to boarding school in England. Now, let's admit, all of us complained to our parents about our school, but Lewis's really was bad. He called it the concentration camp, and it was one. He begs to be allowed to come home. Eventually, his dad let him switch schools, and eventually he's going to be tutored by someone that we'll hear about. But he gets his revenge. Dreadful English schools appear throughout the Narnia tales, right, if you know about them. Edmund goes to a really bad one in Language and Wardrobe. Supposedly that's where all the trouble began. And of course, Eustace Clarence Scrubb goes to one, anybody know the name? Experiment House, aptly named, right? By the way, Eustace Clarence Scrubb is a little reference to Lewis himself. Very smart, not good in sports, a bit of a prig, right? Clarence Scrubb has the same 2 initials as CS, and Eustace sounds a little like Lewis. And the voyage of the Dawn Treader begins. Once there was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it, right? Just like Lewis in his first name. Despite his dislike for school, Lewis is a superb student, excellent in English but weak in math. From 15 to 18, he finishes education with a tutor, William Kirkpatrick, who had taught Albert. Now he's retired, taking on students. Kirk will be the model for the professor in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's Professor Kirk. And of course, if you go back in time and read what? The magician's nephew, his whole name is Diggory Kirk, where we see him as a boy. In 1916, so Lewis is 17 years old, while waiting for a train, seemingly by accident, Lewis just happens to pick up a used copy of it. Here's a book, I've heard 16 pronunciations, so if you know the correct one and I don't, excuse me, I call it Fantastes by the Scottish clergyman George MacDonald. And you know, once you start studying Lewis, if you want to read like who Lewis read, you'll pick up George MacDonald, who's one of his favorite authors. And he's not a Christian, he's far from it, right? He's quite the atheist, a serious atheist. Anyway, he says it baptized his imagination and would influence him for the rest of his life. In 1917, Lewis doesn't go to Villanova, he doesn't go to Asbury, he only goes to Oxford University, Oxford. And he's there for just a short time, and this is something that it's still hard for me to get my mind around. Think of you at 18, 19, being sent off to fight in World War I, right? That's the age people were drafted to send. He didn't have to go, he was from Northern Ireland, but he went anyway. So he goes to fight in World War I, where he's wounded, hit in the back with shrapnel, and gets sent home. In 1919, after recovering from his injury, Lewis returns to his studies at Oxford and publishes his first book, Spirits in Bondage, at age 20. Now, if you're over 20, well, you're already over the hill, because Lewis has already published a book by then, right? If you're behind. Having said that, it's not a very good book, and if Lewis hadn't gone on to write better books, none of us would know of this book. It's a book of, well, not so great poetry. It gets little noticed. And in 1922, he's awarded his BA in philosophy with his highest honors at age 23. At Oxford, and maybe you've studied a little bit of the Oxford-Cambridge program, but you can understand it sort of, because it's kind of like ours, but it's always different, and so you're always like, I don't quite get that. Anyway, you can get a first or a second or a third, but to get a third is, well, kind of like the gentleman's C minus. It tells the world you weren't a very good student. Anyway, he gets a double first in philosophy. Like you, humanities majors, he has trouble getting a job immediately in philosophy. Like you, he tells his mom and dad, I should stay on and get another degree. And oddly enough, if Lewis had been able to get that job in philosophy, we would never have heard of him today. He might have become sort of I'll just say this, a not very famous philosopher. I don't know any other philosophers from the 1920s or 30s, but he can't get a job, so he goes back and gets a degree in English. 1923, no teaching positions in philosophy are available. Lewis remains at Oxford for another degree and another first in English language and literature. 1925, at age 26, he's elected a fellow, and if you look at that word, and that word is Magdalene, Mary Magdalene, right from the Bible, right? But they don't say it that way. They pronounce it the way they do in Middle English. It's Magdalene. And if you go to Oxford, and some of you have probably been, if you haven't been, I'm sure you'll go, and you'll want to, go visit C.S. Lewis's college, because it's pretty beautiful. Even if Lewis didn't go there, it's of interest. So you say, I'm curious, can you show me, I'm looking for Magdalene College. And, excuse me? Magdalene College? Oh, I think you guys pronounce it Magdalene. Oh, Magdalene College. They pretend like they don't understand you. Anyway, they say Magdalene. A position he will hold for 29 years until he's made a professor at Cambridge. Well, there's another slight difference. Everyone gets hired typically as a tutor or a fellow or a don. And I'll just say this, there's a slight difference between those that I've never been able to figure out. They're all slightly different. Anyway, he's passed over for professor twice. And the thinking is he's passed over professor because, well, his politics are a little too conservative, right? He's a Christian, and he's been writing great English literature that's quite famous. He's been also writing this other kind of literature, like the Chronicles of Narnia and the Screwtape Letters. And that's kind of frowned on at the big R1 school. He gets passed over for professorship twice. He's really good friends with Tolkien. And after they pass him over the second time, Tolkien does, I can't believe it. He calls Cambridge, who's been trying to get Lewis to come and take a chair, a professor's chair. Says, I think you can get Lewis now, right? Because it's clear he's not going to get a professorship there. He goes to Cambridge, he gets his chair. As soon as Oxford hears it, oh, we'd like you to come here and we'll make a chair for you. And he has this lovely, tells Oxford, don't already have a chair over there. Anyway, little side strip. He's made professor in Cambridge in 1954 at age 55. He publishes Dimer. Remember, this is his second book. You've never heard of it because it's a book of bad poetry. He's 27. It, too, gets little notice. And shortly afterwards, Lewis writes these words to a friend. From the age of 16 onwards, I had one single ambition from which I never wavered, in the prosecution of which I spent every ounce I could, and recognized myself as having unmistakably failed in it. The side of me which longs not to write, all of you can write, but to be approved as a writer, to get recognition as a writer. It's not the side of me that is really worth much. Part 2, a chance meeting and a change in direction. In 1926, Lewis meets and becomes friends with this other faculty member, J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, I'm going to say that name wrong about every other time, because I grew up in the south side of Chicago, no one knew who Tolkien was, and I called him Tolkien. And then I met some people who know, and they say, no, it's Tolkien, like I'm keen on Tolkien. Having said that, if you watch a documentary with people who know him, they'll call him different things. So you'll be in very good company, but I think it's supposed to be Tolkien. I'll probably say Tolkien every other time. The two share a passion for fantasy and myth. Unlike Lewis, Tolkien is about Christian, some of you must know about Catholic, very serious Catholic. 1930, Lewis moves into the kilns, and flip it over if you will, and there's a picture of the kilns. And I may have mentioned this once or twice. I've slept in Lewis's bedroom. It's the second set of windows up there on the top. Anyway, that's the house he buys and lives in for the rest of his life. Flip it back. During World War II, children evacuated from London will stay there as they do in The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. If you've seen the movie or read the book, 4 kids come up from London. Unlike Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, 4 girls come to stay. And unlike Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, they're bored all the time. They keep saying, what should we do now? What should we do now? Whereas the Pevensies are full of action, right? They're running around the house, playing hide and seek. They're playing cricket out in the yard. Anyway, with Tolkien forms a writing group called the Inklings. And those of you who want to be writers, you could do far worse than follow Lewis's example and form some sort of writing group, both for encouragement and critique. Not just, hi, I love you, this is great, but also maybe you ought to change this because it's not as strong as something. They got both, a lot of both. A lot of great encouragement and a lot of really hammer and tongs critique. A reading and writing group that will meet in Lewis's rooms at the college and at the Eagle and Child. And there's a picture of this pub, and you can go and sit in the very spot where Screwtape's Letters was read for the first time, where The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings were read for the first time. You know, you can have a fish and chips and a shepherd's pie and sit right there. And if you're a Lewis Tolkien fan, well, it's pretty nice, right? Some Some of the world's favorite stories are premiered at these meetings. Tolkien would later describe, this is a quote, the unpayable debt he owed Lewis, stating, this is one of, this, we can just stop at this. He was for long my only audience. Think of the Lord of the Rings. Think how many millions and millions of copies are out there. But for a while, in this world, there was one person who believed in it, C.S. Lewis. And he kept told us, where's the next chapter? You got to finish it up. No, this is going nowhere. No, you got to write it. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. Tolkien quit, dead stop for months twice. Each time Lewis is there saying, in his own British way, Tolkien, don't leave me hanging, right? Merry Pippin just got dragged off by orcs. You're going to stop here? What are you, nuts? I need the next chapter. I need it next Thursday. Meet me at the pub. I want to hear it. Yeah. You could say that C.S. Lewis saved Middle-earth. All right, flip it over. 1931, September 19th, Tolkien and Hugo Dyson helped Lewis see the connection between myth and truth on a late-night walk of Addison's Walk. Next to his college, there's this lovely walk right next to it. And this leads to his joining the faith. And I'll just say this, if you're a Lewis and Tolkien fan, you can still stroll that little walk next to Magdalen College. Looks just the same as it did when Lewis was there. Probably looks just the same as it did when Addison was there. And if you can, go there in September when the wind is blowing through the trees and walk there at night. On September 28th, during a motorcycle ride with warning to Whipsnade Zoo, the final piece falls into place and Lewis becomes a Christian. Changes what he writes. In 1933, he publishes the first of his Christian works. He's age 34. The Pilgrim's Regress. And I'll just say this is better than his poetry, but it's not his best yet. An allegorical story of an everyman character named John and his search for the object of the longing that is haunted him. Meanwhile, in 1937, Tolkien publishes The Hobbit. He's 45. And in 1938, at age 40, Lewis publishes Out of the Silent Planet, the first book in his space trilogy. It's pretty good. It's his first really good book. In 1940, he also publishes a different kind of work, nonfiction, fancy name. I didn't know what it meant growing up. His first apologetic work. It really means a nonfiction book that looks at a faith issue and tries to make sense of it. He's not apologizing for anything. You get that out of your mind, right? It's an apologetic work. And so, if you haven't heard the word, it sounds funny. So Lewis was a Christian apologist, as well as a fiction writer, as well as a bad poetry writer. Okay? In 1942, he publishes the Screwtape Letters, and it becomes his breakout book. Future writers of the world, first you want to get a book out. Second, you want to get a breakout book, a book that sells a lot of copies. If you wanted to, you could quit your day job. And it puts him on the cover of Time magazine in 1947. There he is on Time magazine, September 8th, age 48. And take a look. On one shoulder, you can see that little double Screwtape. I looked at this cover for 10 years until I looked at the other side. There's another angel, a good angel, on the other side. So those of you who are going to read Screwtape Letters, we get the whole world from Screwtape's opinion. But by the time you get to the end, it's clear that Screwtape and Wormwood, who are there to tempt him and turn him, well, to the dark side, there's equally good angels trying to turn him the other way. And interestingly, on the cover of Time, they have that little angel swing over the other side, which for years I didn't notice. In 1948, he begins working in earnest on the Chronicles of Narnia at age 49. I've been speaking to young people, telling you to dream big. Those of you who are like 49-ish, your best work may be yet to come, right? Don't give up the ship. Your world fame is just, well, maybe some of you maybe 4 or 5 years away, right? He starts writing at 49 on the Chronicles of Narnia, and truth be told, he had started writing the first paragraph 8 years earlier when those 4 girls came to stay with him, and he wrote a paragraph and it got stuck. Now, some of you have a paper due in a week or two, midterms coming up. You can't do what Lewis did. He took this piece of paper that he started Lion Witch on, sticks it in a drawer, and 8 years later he pulls it out and says, oh, let me see if I can make this into a story. It becomes the Lion Witch in the Wardrobe. Now, you can't wait 8 years to get unstuck. But if you find yourself getting stuck, well, you're in good company, because Lewis did too. In 1950, The Lion Witch in the Wardrobe is published. The other 6 books in the series are published 1 a year. When The Last Battle appears in 1956, he's 57. It wins the Carnegie Medal as the best young person's book in England. And look, I could talk more about Lewis than you ever wanted to hear. My wife, by the way, has said thank you all for allowing me to come talk to you, because what? She's invented a new word. She's Lewised out. But I could tell you that there's a big Lewis scholar scandal over the order of the books, right? They originally, Lion Witch was first. Anyway, they got renumbered in 1980 after Lewis is dead. They didn't really want to renumber. They put in chronological order. And some of you know the Star Wars thing, right? So when I was your age, I went and saw Star Wars Episode 4, and here's Luke Skywalker and a grown-up Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then we go back in time. And it makes sense to go back and say, oh, that's where Obi-Wan came from. Oh, that's how Darth Vader became Darth Vader. It works better to have the prequel kind of later in the thing. So The Magician's Nephew, which is now number 1, used to be numbered 6. And I think it should stay at number 6, and so do most world scholars. But we can talk about that afterwards, because it's the kind of thing that most scholars. Part number 3, Surprised by Joy. Lewis is going to write an autobiography called Surprised by Joy. There's a second kind of joy he's going to be surprised by. In 1952, he publishes Mere Christianity, a printed version of his BBC talks. If you ever pick up Mere Christianity, know that that was first a radio broadcast during World War II, when the bombs were falling like rain. And England turned to someone who could articulate the faith, who could inspire them. And they turned to the honest figure, someone who had never been on the radio in his life, and taught medieval and Renaissance English at Oxford University. And it said that Lewis's voice, they had him do a series of 4, they had him do a second series, a third series, a fourth series. By the time he was done, his voice was the second most recognized voice in all of England, second only to Winston Churchill. Anyway, BBC Talks first, then Mere Christianity. December 24th meets Joy Gresham, an American, and winner of the Yale Poetry Award in '38 for her book of free verse, Letter to a Comrade. And I'll just say this, we'll come back to that. She had been, like many intellectuals at her time, East Coast intellectuals, by the way, a member of the Communist Party, thinking that was going to be a good idea. Later on, she dropped it. Lewis is 53, she's 37, a recent convert to Christianity. She and her husband, Bill, who is also a writer, will divorce after his problems with alcohol, spouse abuse, and infidelity. In 1953, Joy and her sons, David and Douglas, moved to England. And that Douglas that you see there will be Lewis's stepson, who eventually graciously wrote a foreword to my biography. In 1954, after being passed over for a professor's chair at Oxford, you know what happens. Lewis accepts the chair of medieval and Renaissance English at Cambridge, a position which Tolkien was largely responsible for creating. In September, Lewis finally sees the publication of his monumental work, English Literature in the 16th Century. It becomes the most popular and significant volume in the Oxford History of English Literature series. They have their most famous scholar write one for each century. They wanted Lewis to do his century, and this is the one that sold out, went to Philippines. But he never, it took him forever to do it, and he called it his Oh Hell book, based on history of English literature. In 1955, Surprised by Joy, Lewis's autobiography of his early life is published. And if you'd like to know more about Lewis, there's a number of good biographies. But his own autobiography is called Surprised by Joy. And the idea is he's this serious atheist. Serious, hardcore atheist. Kind of anti-Christian atheist. Anyway, every so often, though, there's this longing that he perceives. And it's really a beautiful, sweet longing for, well, something more. Nothing he seems to find can satisfy it. And eventually he concludes in Christianity, if I have this longing in me that nothing can satisfy, it must be that I was made for another world. Anyway, Surprised by Joy comes from a Wordsworth sonnet, and it's the first line. And like Wordsworth, he was surprised. As an atheist, he thought, why should this be here? Why should I have this strange longing? 1956, Joy has trouble renewing her visa. Was it because she was a member of the Communist Party? Was it because she was living on child support and the state thought she might become, dependent on the state? It's unclear, but the Home Office does not renew her visa. She's going to be sent home with the 2 boys to the abusive husband, right? To allow her to remain in England, Lewis marries her in a civil ceremony at the Oxford Registry Office. The arrangements are kept a secret. This is just a marriage of convenience, so Lewis can extend his citizenship to her and the boys. And then, if you've seen the movie Shadowlands, there's a BBC version with Joss Auckland, fine British actor. There's also an Anthony Hopkins, Deborah Winger version. This is their story. She's found to have cancer. And there's a picture, by the way, of the first edition Lion Witch, and there's a picture of Joy Gresham. And I'll tell you this, Deborah Winger in the movie did a pretty good job of looking like her. In 1957, March 21st, as death nears, Joy has one wish, that they fall in love now. Real love, not a love of convenience, that they could be married in the church. All right? So, Reverend Peter Bide, who's a former student of Lewis, in a small Christian ceremony in her hospital, marries them. Deathbed marriage. And Bide asks, would they like him to offer a special prayer for healing? And I don't know what to think about this, but Peter Bide says to him, and very often he says, look, I'm an Anglican pastor. Every so often, as you guess, I pray for the sick, and I'll just say this. There's been some things I find pretty miraculous. Would you like me to pray a prayer of healing for you here? And when I say pray a prayer, he doesn't work himself. He just opens the English Book of Common Prayer and reads that prayer. It's pretty regular, right? Anyway, this is what he does. She's sent home to die by 3 doctors and a bunch of nurses. They said, take her home. And she has weeks. Well, she gradually recovers and they enjoy 3 wonderful years together, and this time together is the focus of the film Shadowlands. But in 1959, October, Joy's cancer is returned. In 1960, Joy dies. Lewis will record his despair in this book, A Grief Observed. And the idea that if you have a lot of faith or you're a sincere Christian, that you don't grieve, you don't mind, is kooky, crazy. Now, you may not grieve as someone who doesn't have any hope, but you still grieve. Lewis had a terrible time when his wife dies. And he has what, when I was an undergrad, would have called a blue book. I don't know if you use them anymore. But there's 4 of these sitting in his house. And he says, okay, I'm having a terrible time. I'm going to record my feelings in these blue books, and I'm going to fill them up. And when the 4th one is done, I'm done. True story. So those 4 become the 4 sections of A Grief Observed. And he publishes it in 1961 under the pseudonym of N.W. Clerk, which in his mind is Anglo-Saxon for not black clerk. Who knows which clerk wrote this? Anonymous. All right. True story. So Lewis, after the book comes out, it doesn't sell a lot, but it sells a few. It's kind of a specialty book about grieving. One of his friends comes up and says, Jack, yeah, I know you're still having trouble with Joy's death. I found a little book that I think might help you, and hands him a copy of A Grief Observed. Well, Lewis then says, he says, look, I have to tell you this. I wrote that. He said, oh my gosh. His friend convinced him. He says, look, you have to publish this under your own name, at least after you're dead and gone, because it will reach more people. And in fact, it has. It has reached many people who have suffered bereavement with the loss of a loved one. It's really quite honest, isn't full of glib answers, but reaches resolution at the end. In 1963, Jack has a heart attack. He's admitted to Auckland nursing home, but he goes into a coma and he recovers. And he makes the oddest thing. He says, I wonder if Lazarus was really glad he got brought back. Because, he's older and he's ailing, and he thinks, that would have been a pretty good way to go. In August, he returns to Kilman, and then November 22nd, Jack dies at home. And if you know anything about November 22nd, 1963, that was the day JFK was shot in America. So Lewis's death would have been a slightly bigger deal, except for the fact that Kennedy was killed here. And I know there's no connection. It just seems the oddest thing that when Mother Teresa died a few years ago, that was the same day as Princess Di died. And so Princess Di's death way overshadowed Mother Teresa's. 2005, 55 years after its debut, The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe was made into a major motion picture by Walden Media. Prince Caspian follows in 2008. Voyage of the Dawn Treader is released in December 2010. And the rumor is that Douglas Gresham wasn't happy with the second and third film. He became less and less happy. Great books that are being made into mediocre films and mediocre commercial successes. Pull the plug. Has to wait 7 years. So if you got a 7 to 2010, the rumor is that in 2017, the silver chair will be made. So, all right, if you have questions from this, hold on to it. But I'm going to talk briefly about C.S. Lewis, why he matters today. And I'm going to show it piece by piece. So I'm going to talk, show 2.5 minutes, talk, show in 2.5 minutes. And in between, I'm going to have to turn up the lights. So we'll see if it works. Why C.S. Lewis matters today. There's an old saying, when the pupil is ready, the master will appear. Right? And maybe that's happened in your life. You had a great high school teacher who showed up right when you were ready, or maybe the older brother of a friend, or an older sister of a friend who was there to kind of show you. As many of you have already learned, life has a special way of sending us just the right person at just the right time to teach us just the exact lesson we're supposed to learn right then. When the pupil is ready, the master will appear. For countless people all over the world, C.S. Lewis has been a teacher and a mentor whose books and writings appeared at just the right time in their lives, just as the time they were needed most. The documentary you're about to see seeks to answer the question of why C.S. Lewis, an Oxford scholar who specialized in medieval and Renaissance literature, still matters today, 50 years after his death back in 1963. In one sense, you could say this film is a 24-minute thank you letter. A letter from a number of his, pretty famous pupils to one of their greatest teachers, a way to honor and celebrate C.S. Lewis. But it's more than that. It's more than a way of expressing gratitude. The testimony of those who appear in the film, if you know them, they're pretty famous. Eric Metaxas, New York Times bestselling author. Tim Keller, Michael Flaherty, president of Walden that made the films. And you'll see Douglas Gresham, Lewis's stepson, is a way to stand side by side with Lewis and to honor what he honored and to celebrate what he celebrated. Clive Staples Lewis was born, as you know, in Belfast, Northern Ireland, 1898. He died 65 years later in the sleepy English village of Headington Quarry outside of Oxford, leaving behind 40 books of, as you know, Christian apologetics, poetry, literary criticism, science fiction, and I would say the most amazing set of fairy tales ever written in English. Though it's hard to imagine a world without the Screwtape Letters, without mere Christianity, without the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis nearly took a very different path in life. In part one, we learned that Professor Lewis was not always a famous Christian writer, and he was not always even a Christian. Part one, the prologue.
As the Industrial Revolution rolled to the end of the 19th century, a new revolution began that would transform much of Western civilization. The dawn of the 20th century revealed the beginning of a radical shift in the way many thinkers and leaders viewed the world and our place in it. Ancient documents, previously held to be divine biblical truth for centuries, were now seen as only primitive superstitions, comforting illusions that had nothing to do with reality. Hard sciences took the place formerly held by philosophy and their realms of study. That which can be seen, touched, and measured became the only area of study with any claim on truth. Men and women were no longer seen as being created in the image of God, or even created at all. Humans were like all life on earth, merely advanced animals, evolved through meaningless, purposeless chance. And God became merely a figment of childish wishes, something intelligent adults outgrew, like an infant's nursery. It was into this world that Clive Staples Lewis was born in 1898, and it was here that he was raised and educated. He quickly became one of its more vocal adherents. As a young man, he wrote to a friend, "I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them, and from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, that is all mythologies, to give them a proper name, are merely man's inventions." In 1925, after graduating with highest honors from Oxford with degrees in philosophy and literature, Lewis was invited to join the faculty. Before long, he became close friends with the company of believers, chief among them J.R.R. Tolkien. Much to Lewis's surprise, it was they who began to influence him rather than the reverse. Through these friends, Lewis came to see Christianity as intellectually credible, and despite his great desire to simply be left alone by God, his great change gradually began to take place. About his conversion, Lewis wrote, "In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England."
After Lewis's conversion, he went on not just to become a Christian and a strong Christian, but the most influential Christian writer of the 20th century.
He has an ability to speak about God in a way that doesn't just talk about the imagination, but that actually uses imagination and that pulls our imagination in, which I would make the argument that without that you can't really know God. And so there's something about Lewis's role in the canon of Western literature that is genuinely unique.
He not only provided this clear articulation of what it means to be a Christian in his own life, he demonstrated what it means to be a Christian in today's modern world.
Christianity for Lewis was something that captured the mind, fired the imagination, and filled the heart. Becoming a Christian was something that changed the very way he viewed the world and the people who lived in it.
The next part of exploring why C.S. Lewis matters today, we will learn of his great efforts to reclaim Christian reason and to restore it to its proper place. In his writings and through the example of his own life, Professor Lewis encourages all to ask questions about our faith, serious questions, hard questions, and to search for serious answers. Part 2, Reclaiming Christian Reason.
By presenting a defense of the Christian faith that appealed to reason, Lewis removed obstacles to belief that many people faced.
Lewis saw reason as being the anchor of faith. He knew that a faith that was based only on emotions would be the kind of faith that would change from one moment to the next.
Faith in the sense in which I am here using the word, he wrote, is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted, in spite of your changing moods. Lewis pointed out, our hearts must be on fire for the things of God, and so must our reason. While God wants us to be as loving and teachable as children, Lewis underlined that God also wants every bit of intelligence we have.
He's the best that God has given us so far at reaching his world, at fencing with stupidity, and of ever so gently, but knife with a little twist in it, puncturing the pomposity and the pretensions of so-called thinkers.
For example, in Miracles, when he actually goes after the idea that you can't trust your reason, you can't trust your thinking if we simply are the product of random chance evolution. That's a kind of presuppositional argument. He's basically saying, if there is no God, you can't actually even trust your reason. And of course, Alvin Plantinga later on took that idea and has developed it much more completely. So he uses all kinds of arguments. They've been extremely helpful to me.
When the imagination is divorced from reason, when faith is divorced from reason, we go in all sorts of strange directions. Lewis is an absolute consummate genius in bringing together and keeping together, tied in a good strong knot, faith and reason. And so by following Lewis, we are following the path of orthodoxy. In other words, the path of Christianity, which is rational and faithful.
Lewis showed us through his own example as a world-class literature scholar at one of the world's premier institutions of learning what it means to have a mind of Christ and to love God with all your heart and all your mind.
For example, he talks about naturalism, the idea that there is not a creator, that we are simply a material product. We are the result of some natural processes of evolution. And he says people who believe that have a deep problem because they have to rely upon a brain that was formed by a natural process to make an informed judgment. So how can they know that their brain is reliable? He said naturalism is like someone trying to lift himself up by his collar. He won't be able to get off the ground, but he may strangle himself.
He started out totally an agnostic, searching every option, other religions, science, atheism. He looked at everything. And the fact is, he gave it a long-term, concentrated, serious study. And at the end of the path, he found Christianity.
I think his most important contributions in general to the world have been, well, obviously his books of Christian apologetics, A Grief Observed being one of them, Mere Christianity, The Great Divorce. His science fiction trilogy are hugely advantageous for people to read, because not only are they great literature and great science fiction, but they're also hugely instructive about the nature of man. At the time Jack wrote those, the tradition in science fiction was that man went out into the stars and met the alien monsters who tried to kill everybody and so forth. Jack turned that on his head, and man goes out into the stars and is the alien monster that tries to kill everybody.
For Lewis, loving God with all your mind was not really just reading a book or two, but a call to be a whole different kind of person. For Lewis, this call to use your reason and your faith together was not just an intellectual pursuit, but a way of being very present in today's modern world.
By restoring reason to its rightful place, Lewis showed how Christianity could appeal to those who were earnestly seeking for answers to the great questions of life.
Part 3, rediscovering Christian imagination. While some Christians, and maybe you know some, may view imagination like something scary, something they should view with distrust, Lewis felt the purpose of the Christian imagination is not merely to make wonders into facts, to take the facts of our everyday world, the facts, and reveal the wonder that is in them. As we will see, for Professor Lewis, the primary value of the imagination was not to make things up, but to allow us to see things as they really are. His imaginative fairy tales are intended to stir and to trouble us with a glimpse of something wonderful, something just beyond our reach. Part 3, rediscovering Christian imagination.
As a boarding school student, Lewis labeled the mandatory chapel just an opportunity to daydream. Looking back on a childhood of tedious church lessons filled with cliches and formulaic answers, the adult Lewis turned to the imagination to recapture the true power of the gospel.
And he said that his faith became paralyzed because of what he called its stained glass associations. By recasting these elements, these spiritual truths from the gospel story, into an imaginary world, he hoped that he could, for the first time, at least for him, convey them in their true potency, their real power.
But Lewis understood that learning is not just by the mind alone. The mind, he said, is the organ of reason, but the imagination is the organ of understanding. So you need both reason, both cognitive understanding, and the imagination. And that nothing penetrates the imagination better than Lewis's writing, and particularly his fantasies, which are so popular with children.
He said why he thought Narnia was so effective is that the passion of Aslan took people by surprise. They were very familiar with the whole Jesus story, but that Aslan's death and resurrection, they didn't see it coming, and therefore it was much more moving to them. And I think that's the hallmark of all good myth, is that it flies under the radar of your defenses. You have your defenses up against Christian truth. Nah, don't believe that, don't want to go there, don't tell me about it, don't want to hear it. But you get dragged into Tolkien, or you get dragged into Lewis. We have testimonies in our worship services quite frequently, and just recently we've had both a Tolkien and a Lewis conversion testimony.
Lewis's own particular brand of evangelism, I think he would say, didn't take a direct form. It wasn't come down the altar and be baptized. He might even call it pre-evangelism. He saw that his gift, his own particular gift, was to break down the kind of obstacles to belief that people had then and still have today.
So we take reason seriously, as we should, but then we take it too seriously, and we forget that there are some things, notably the gospel and the truth of the gospel, that cannot only be communicated via reason. It has to be communicated via story.
You're able to access the meaning through your imagination, and it awakens in you a hunger for something that you really didn't know that you were hungry for.
The idea of story, it's a fundamentally, intrinsically human concept, the notion of story and narrative, which is genuinely essential for communicating the kind of truth that we find in the gospel. If we're talking about just rational truth, we're talking about facts, then you don't need it. But when you're talking about the gospel of Jesus Christ, you're talking about something that necessarily needs, at least in part, to be communicated via story, period.
And Lewis and Tolkien realized that the imagination is the means by which we arrive at the truth. And the imagination is not in conflict with reason. In fact, if the imagination leads us in an irrational direction to an irrational area, it's a failure of the imagination as well as a failure of the reason.
I think Lewis, as a medieval scholar, as someone who had studied the mythology of Norsemen, of Greeks, was well steeped in the power of imagination, the power of story, and the power of creativity. He combined that with his faith in a way that just opened people's eyes to imagining a world where the story of Christ wasn't a myth, but was a lived reality.
If somebody had tried to hit me with Jesus, I had all kinds of cultural misconceptions, preconceptions, that would have just made me uninterested. But because Aslan is in a mythological mode, you're able to access truth with your imagination that your mind would have defenses against.
Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Lewis writes. Perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments, as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of the worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly a century. Almost our whole education has been directed to silencing this shy, persistent inner voice.
I read a quote the other day that truth will always be more important than the facts. And I think to really understand what real truth is, the imagination has to be a part of that. And I think C.S. Lewis understood it very well.
C.S. Lewis believed that Christian imagination could expand our sense of what's possible. He believed the Christian imagination could re-enchant a world that has been disenchanted by the limited possibilities of modern science.
Lewis was well aware of the power that stories created by a Christian imagination have to present understandable concepts which could be approached in no other fashion, a kind of writing that could express the inexpressible.
In part 4, we look at Professor Lewis's goal of restoring a Christian vision of humanity. And I don't know to what extent Lewis is your cup of tea. Maybe you're quite the Lewis fan, maybe you're thinking, he's not for me. But there's a reason why I put this when I wrote the script, third and final. I met Lewis when I was 16 years old, and like most young people, I thought I was not funny enough, cute enough, smart enough, rich enough, fill in the blank. And if you ever felt like you're not enough, Lewis reminds us that, no, that's not true. You're not just a nothing. You're not just an orange that can be eaten by society and a peel thrown away like in Willy Loman. He's good at that. Those of you who are my age have seen the old WonderWorks BBC version of the Chronicles of Narnia. And it's pretty bad in some ways. But it's pretty good in one way that the modern ones are not. The 4 children that go to Narnia look like you and me and our next door neighbor. In the modern Chronicles of Narnia, they're all glamorous and they're good looking and they're pretty cool in ways that I'm not. But in that old BBC one, I mean, when Lucy puts on that fur coat, you're not sure, is that Mr. Beaver, is that Lucy? Because she's got big buck teeth that looks like a normal kid. And Lewis wants to remind us that there's something noble about all of us. There's 4 very old, very ordinary kids, right? As Susan says in the movie, we can't be kings and queens. We can't fulfill the prophecy. We're from Finchley. That there's something pretty darn special about all of us. Anyway, this is part 4. In a world where people are often viewed like replaceable parts of a machine, it felt like that, merely objects to be used, manipulated, and tossed aside, Lewis pointed out the great value of each individual person and emphasized each individual's potential destiny. Part 4, restoring a Christian vision of humanity.
As a young atheist, C.S. Lewis agreed with many other thinkers of his day that the universe was all there is, that life was just an accident, and that human beings were nothing more than a result of random evolution. But after his conversion, all this changed. The order, complexity, and vastness of the universe became a reflection of a creator, of someone beyond the universe. After coming to a belief in God, Lewis also came to see all life as having a divine origin and saw in human beings the image of that divinity.
What was it that caused C.S. Lewis to risk his academic reputation and to spend just so much time every day, whether in writing letters, speaking on the BBC, publishing essays, writing books? I believe it's this radical vision that Lewis had for the eternal destiny of every human being.
I think that humanity is what enabled him to speak so profoundly into our lives. He's a person who had experienced grief, who'd experienced doubt, who understood that we are all less than perfect and also, right beside the angels.
He speaks to us where we are in a way that almost no one does. There's something about his ability to talk about God in non-religious terms, which is not only important, but at this point, vital.
In today's culture, that emphasis of Lewis, that humanity is of supreme value, very precious as bearing the image of God, is important because of the dehumanizing aspects of culture, whether it's through media or through scientific advance. People misconstrue those to devalue and dehumanize, and Lewis was always a sworn opponent of that kind of trend.
Today we live in a media-driven culture where people are bombarded with media messages every day. Some researchers indicate 5,000 a day messages we're getting bombarded with. In that world, we are beat down, we are lectured to, we are hammered on, and I think we grow smaller and smaller and smaller in our own eyes. I think Lewis understood the radical view of humanity, that we are free, we are liberated, we have, because of what Christ has done on the cross, it's changed everything.
you can't say that every human being has a little God in them, the way sort of some people like to say in our culture today. That we're all children of God in a general way, and there's a little bit of God in all of us. There's something to what they're saying, but that's actually more misleading than it is true. I think what they're sensing is that the Bible says God made every human being in His own image, and that seems to mean there's something about human beings that reflects the glory of God. So there's a dignity about every human being, there's a greatness about human beings, even when they're ruined by sin, and you can sense it. In fact, somebody once said, if you even see a ruined castle, it's still magnificent, even though you can't even live in it. But you can see what it was, and you can see how great it was designed to be. And there's something magnificent even about the ruin. And I think that even ruined by sin, human beings, being in the image of God, have this greatness about them, and therefore there is a sacredness about them.
Lewis, by using imagination, shows what we really are. It's this biblical idea that we are created in the image of God, and just to think about that doesn't mean that we're cookie cutters, that we're made in the image of God in a simplistic way, but that we are something ineffable, we're something at least in part ethereal, we're something eternal. To be able to communicate that as Lewis does is, again, infinitely important. There's almost no one I can think of who's done it the way he's done it.
Well, I mean, that notion that Lewis would often say that there is no ordinary person, you are talking to an immortal being, and those are the kinds of ideas that you just wouldn't hear at a revival tent meeting. Nothing against revival tent meetings, but it kind of blew a lot of our minds, those kinds of very simple ideas, yet they're rooted in the Christian tradition, but so fresh and so novel. And you just wonder where those kinds of thoughts came from.
And I think in the Chronicles of Narnia and in the Space Trilogy and in The Great Divorce, he shows how ordinary people are extraordinary. That's the paradox. And of course, ordinary people are extraordinary because they're made in the image of God, all of us. And we're both unique and yet united in our humanity. And that makes all of us capable of going to heaven and capable of going to hell. So everything we do has eternal significance for ourselves and for others.
C.S. Lewis had a radical view of humanity. Here's what he wrote. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal. And their life to ours is as the life of a gnat.
You haven't met a mere mortal because there are no such creatures. We aren't mortal. We are given a choice of which direction to go for our immortality and eternity. But eternity, get used to the eye, you're standing in it.
Part 5 epilogue. Born in 1898, the final decade of the 1800s, Lewis's life, work, and legacy now spans 3 centuries. And though he's buried in the churchyard of his local parish 50 years ago, the life and work of C.S. Lewis leaves each of us today with a challenge to find our own vocation. What is your calling, Secretary? What will your contribution be? How will you make a difference? Will you dare to dream big? We close with the epilogue, a final look at why C.S. Lewis matters today.
The first demand of any great work of art is surrender. Look, listen, receive. Get yourself out of the way, for until you have gotten yourself out of the way, you have no idea whether you should have surrendered or not. An experiment in criticism, C.S. Lewis.
Lewis wrote about this. It is critical that as we call ourselves Christians, that we see some differences being made in the lives of people around us and in the kinds of things we are doing to demonstrate the gospel, the things that God is calling us to do out of gratitude to Him for His Son's death on the cross in our place.
And I think a lot of times, as believers, we're always looking for those things that separate us. And we're always looking for those things that we want to criticize in the culture. And we want to cast as much light on things that we think that are wrong. I like the emphasis on finding the things that unite us. And I love the idea of lighting a candle rather than cursing the darkness.
I would like to think that the movies we make are part of Jack's contribution. Entertainment, I believe, should not only entertain, it should not only make money, it should also educate and assist society in general. And I think the Narnian Chronicles movies are doing that to a great degree. at a time when they're desperately needed.
He also models what it is for a faithful Christian person to take his gifts and skills and opportunities and sort of parlay them into a contribution to culture that is a faithful witness to Christian faith.
He was the purveyor to popular culture of these wonderful ideas, and that tradition has continued. His ideas live on through bands that I work with like Sixpence None the Richer. They live on through movies like the Narnia movies and through books. And so he's a chain. In fact, his ideas lived on through politicians. There's a great story about Ronald Reagan in 1978 being asked whether Christ was the only path to God, and he regurgitates C.S. Lewis's line that Christ is either liar, lunatic, or Lord. And Reagan gives it spot on. So you have this man, this British man who's been dead for many years, speaking on in pop culture through presidents, through rock bands, and through movies.
Well, I think that the most important thing about Lewis is that the more that he's read, the healthier the church will be. So we have to hope that Lewis in the 21st century, that this Lewis phenomenon, and it has been a phenomenon since his death, and it's an industry now. C.S. Lewis is an industry because the number of people that are reading his books, we have to hope that will continue into the 21st century and throughout the century, because the more people that read C.S. Lewis, the healthier the church will be.
In the end, there is something about taking measure of Lewis's significance that remains beyond our grasp. In the end, the only way to fully appreciate the legacy he left is to pick up his books and to open the doors to the great adventure he left for us inside of them.
We got about 5 minutes left. I want to get you out of here on time. So questions and comments or something you've been thinking about, you raise your hand and yell it out loud and clear. We'll get to it. Anybody? Comment, question, thought? I know it's kind of a big group and kind of intimidating. Yeah, way in the back. And I'm going to turn this down. Can you realize? Somebody? Comment or question? Yes, right here.
As a convert myself, I understand the transition from atheist to a belief in God, but how did Lewis come to find truth in Jesus Christ and Christianity?
Well, that's a great long story. And I'll just say this. For some people, they can say it happened this night and here's how it happened. For Lewis, it was a long period, and I would say he was probably a lot like you. He was very interested in reading and learning, and it began by reading certain authors, and they began to influence him. When he's shot, he's your age, he's in World War I, he gets shot, and he goes to the hospital, and the only book there is this book he's never heard of by this Catholic writer named G.K. Chesterton. He loves the essays, and his faith he can kind of stomach, right? And later on he finds George Herbert, later on he finds George MacDonald. And, you know, when the pupil is ready, the master appears, and in Lewis's life, he says, you know, an unbeliever can't be too careful. There's books lying around all over the place that are going to influence him. At the end, I'll just say this, he had a bias. He loved stories of myth. I mean, if you like sort of the Lord of the Rings, he loved those kind of stories, but the old ones. And at one point, he's walking with Tolkien there, and as he's walking, he says, you know, Lewis, you love these stories, but when it's the Christian story that's sort of like this dying God, you hate it because, well, that's Christian. He pointed out Lewis's Christian bias. And Lewis went away thinking, you know, I kind of do. I mean, J.R. Tolkien was the only person in the world who could have told him that, and he would have accepted it. So I'll recommend, that's a quick, short answer. I'll just say that if you're interested, his story, Surprised by Joy, goes right up to where he becomes a convert. And one of the thoughts about Lewis, why he was so effective, was because he spent most of his years as an atheist, as a serious atheist. And so I'll just say this. He didn't just say the goofy words that no one understands. He could see Christianity from the outside. And that's what made it pretty good at. Great question. Somebody else? Yes?
So, we're here at a Catholic institution, but Lewis was lifelong Anglican.
Yes.
And I know even books have been written about his relationship with the Catholic Church.
Yes.
What's you're here at Catholic University, what was it, what's your take?
Yeah, I'll give you my 2 cents on it. And if you want to be a serious Lewis scholar, there's like been whole books written about C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church. I will say this, it's hard for us to imagine the animosity, the hatred, the bitterness that existed for decades and centuries in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Lewis came home from high school every day and heard his dad and uncles blasting the papists, right? And how stupid they were and devilish they were. He hated that and wanted nothing to do with it. His best friend, the friend that brings him to Christ, is a staunch Roman Catholic, right? And so the idea, and if you haven't picked it up yet, mere Christianity basically says the things that divide believers, I want nothing to do with it. And in my opinion, that's bad. The thing that unites us is great, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And if you know anything about Lewis, this is maybe for Lewis scholars, he was quite a Catholic Anglican, right? Believed in purgatory, believed in confession. Anyway, that's a quick answer. There's a lot more to be said about it. Somebody else had a question? Yes, please.
Why did you choose the Greek observe for the inspiration for your book title?
Yeah, so all it says, Future Authors of the World. This was not my title. My editor chose it, right? So having said that, that's added about 4 times. And when your editor says, I don't like your title, no, they say, how attached are you to your title? And your answer is, I guess not very, right? Because then they come up with another one. I think it's a good one. So a grief observed, he looks at his grief, thinks about it, and I think I tried to do that with Lewis. I looked at his life, I read about it, I read what other people wrote about it, I read how it kind of snuck into his fiction, and tried to not color it too much, because I'll tell you, there's certain biographers that they have an agenda, and they want to show how so-and-so had suffered from an edible complex all his life or something, right? It's not that kind of biography, but you can find that there. So I tried to observe it without coloring it too much. Because there's another kind that says the role of the biographer is to color. Somebody else had a question back here. Yes, sir.
What are the greatest risks to imagination?
That's a good one. Yeah, that's a good one. I'll just say this. I think like anything human, it's there and it's meant to be enjoyed and celebrated. Everything has a sort of a downturn. Obviously, alcohol, pretty good, has a big downturn, right? Food, pretty good, has a big downturn, right? And I would even say the imagination, I think, is quite good. But for some people, it can have a downturn. And I don't know if you've had a friend who plays way too much Dungeons and Dragons and lives in this strange imaginary world that needs to come out and be part more of the real world. Anything to... Lewis is big on talking about this. I mean, you go to the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, and here's Edmund, who's overindulges in Turkish delight, right? And he's trapped by the White Witch. Is Lewis saying that sweets are bad? I don't think so. 2 chapters later, we're there at the Beavers, and they have this delicious spread of fresh trout and marmalade and a hot roll with lots of butter. And at the end, this marmalade, sticky cinnamon comes out of the oven, right? And so Lewis is really saying whether it's the imagination. And I'll give you another one that can be overdone. Reason. Now, don't get me wrong. I tell my students, you guys need to open your books, go home and do your homework. But reason can be overdone. Maybe you have a friend that you say, you need to put the books down and go and watch some TV once in a while. So anything good can be overdone. And by the way, that's an Augustinian idea, this idea of inordinate loves. There's a proper amount of love. And I'll just say this, even for your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your mother, your father. I mean, hopefully you all have loving parents, but it's possible for a mother to love a child too much in this sort of hovery, take care of, protect too much. So anything good can be overdone, including imagination. So I'm going to go Dungeons and Dragons, but maybe it's a video game. Maybe it's something else that's the imagination that breaks us with contact with what I call the real world. What else would you say?
In light of imagination at risk in society.
Oh, yeah. Why, in other words, why?
What are the greatest risks against imagination?
Oh, yeah, give me the good one. How does it help you get a job, right? I mean, do you not hear that every other day? It happens at my school. I'm an English professor. How will this help me get a job, make money, buy a house, have a really cool car, have a big 401k? How will the imagination help you do that? Because our world, I can't decide. Has this always been happening, or is it something that's increasingly, how will this make me money? How will this help me get a job? And oddly enough, I could actually argue from that point of view. I would argue that the imagination that allows you to stand in someone else's shoes, allows you to see how people are going to react to something, is actually a great thing for managers, middle managers, CEOs to have. I could argue that it's purposeful to have a job. And I would never want to say, that's why you should have the imagination. I think the imagination makes our lives richer. Now, I have friends who have read one book in the last 10 years. They're really good people. Some of them are better people than I am, don't get me wrong, right? But Lewis says this, he says, you can't imagine what books have added to your life. You just can't imagine how it makes you a bigger person. He says, I'll help you. You've got a friend somewhere. Imagine a friend who hardly ever reads books. They could be really nice. They could be even nicer than you. But they live in a tiny world. In that world, I would be suffocated, he says. When I read a book, I see the world through 1,000 different eyes. I become 1,000 different men or women or hobbits, right? It makes our lives richer, right? Oh, anyway, that's a quick English teacher's answer. Somebody else had a comment or question, thought. Yes, sir.
Do you have any fun facts about C.S. Lewis? For example, his favorite color or
Yeah. So I'll tell you. I'll give you some of them, and it's kind of weird. So one is, all the. And I'll just say, I come from a Protestant school that's kind of square, right? And I'll just say this: it freaks out certain people at my school that my book cover has the big picture of him smoking a cigarette. Oh my gosh! Yeah. So oddly enough, C.S. Lewis would probably be expelled as a student at my school because he smokes and drinks. Now, I don't know how that fits in here. So that's a big one. The other one that I think is amazing is his friendship with Tolkien. You heard me mention it briefly, but I grew up, these were my two favorite authors, and then one day I discovered, they were best friends. I'm thinking, holy moly, this can't be true, right? I mentioned that you could say that C.S. Lewis saved Middle Earth. Well, you heard the story of how Tolkien was instrumental in Lewis's conversion. You could say that Tolkien saved Narnia, right? So it's kind of a nice way that they work together. Somebody else, question, comment, thought? Maybe one more? Anybody? All right, I'm going to be at the back. I'm going to be selling my books for $10, signed, and a copy of tonight's video for $10. But before I go, I want to say thank you so very much for having me. It was lovely.